Good evening. Welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz the Chidello.
This week, we will ask the judge that stopped Bloomberg's stop and frisk what she thinks of his presidential run.
He made an error, and that error is unforgivable.
Also this week, what's happening in Vegas will not stay in Vegas as the Democrats prepare to debate then caucus again. But first...
The presidential campaign trail wound its way from New Hampshire to Nevada this week. Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders is looking on track for a win, leading by 7 points in last Friday's Las Vegas Review-Journal poll and opening up a dominant 19-point lead in a poll from Data for Progress yesterday. Really bad news for Joe Biden there, slipping to fourth, and if you don't get 15% in a district, you do not get any delegates. As we'll see later in the show, Nevada's caucus is usually low turnout and can swing on Latino support or backings from a union. The 60,000-member Culinary Workers Union hasn't endorsed anyone, but they are warning against Bernie's Medicare for All plan, and they're at war with some Sanders supporters.
Says Sanders would, quote, end culinary health care, while all candidates would strengthen their collective bargaining and right to strike.
Sanders is looking hard to beat, though. There's been talk from some establishment types of convincing some of Sanders' opponents to drop out, leaving only one or two challengers who would gather all the moderate votes, and then they'd blow Sanders out of the water. But it doesn't work like that. Sanders is also often people's second preference. So even one-on-one, Sanders beats Biden. He narrowly beats Warren and he smashes Bloomberg, Buttigieg and Klobuchar by 15 to 20 points each. And by the way, Bloomberg lost one-on-one to every Democrat in that same poll.
He has still got a way to go. So too has Minnesota Senator Amy Klobuchar. She's hoping to turn her third-place finish in New Hampshire into a strong showing in Nevada this weekend. There is no momentum evident in the polls, though. Maybe that has something to do with her knowledge of Mexican politics. This week, her interview with the Spanish-language Telemundo started pretty badly.
What do you know about the Mexican president?
Okay, well, what I will tell you is that I will visit Mexico in the first 100 years.
So not a big priority then. She did correct that, though, saying she, of course, meant the first 100 days. But that could lead to an awkward meeting with the Mexican president.
I'm sorry to ask this, but do you know who he is? Do you know his name?
Yeah. I know that he is the Mexican president.
But can you tell me his name?
No.
Can we just see that clip again? I'd like to isolate the moment that Klobuchar's staffer just got fired.
Do you know who he is? Do you know his name?
Yeah. I know that he is the Mexican president.
That staffer there is about to eat salad with a cone.
And if you don't get that, look it up. For the record, Tom Steyer couldn't name the Mexican president either, as you know it is Andres Obrador, although Mayor Pete could, because he's terribly clever. Actually, it all reminded me of this moment from back in 1999.
The new Pakistani general has just been elected. He's not elected. This guy took over office. He appears he's going to bring stability to the country, and I think that's good news for the subcontinent.
And you can name him.
General. I can't name the general.
And it's...
General.
Yeah, General. And that was the last we saw of whoever that guy was. The wild card in Nevada is tomorrow's candidate debate, though. It was last week's debate that helped to boost Amy Klobuchar in New Hampshire. We'll see just how desperate Joe Biden and Elizabeth Warren are getting right now. This poll with Mike Bloomberg moving into second place nationally also means he has qualified for that debate, the first debate that he will appear in. Bernie has a double-digit lead now. Biden and Warren still slipping. Klobuchar just ahead of Mayor Pete Chaz.
Yeah, that debate is a wild card, but a smaller wild card than it could be, because the 4 days of early voting are happening before the debate, and 59% of poll respondents said that they would vote early. In fact, 36,000 Nevadans voted in just the first 3 days of early voting. That's about 43% of the 2016 turnout. One other ongoing wildcard, by the way, is Bloomberg's billions. Bloomberg is now tied with Sanders in Virginia, and he's actually leading in Florida with Biden 1 point behind him and Buttigieg and Sanders both 15 points back. So, John, tell us more about this fine fellow.
Down here we got snapping turtles. Up there we got big bed bugs. Down here the whale's making trouble. Up there A-Rod's taking drugs. New Yorkers the bravest people. The cops on the beat they care. It's true, firefighters, teachers. We got heroes everywhere. Good life in NYC.
When you're rich, they just let you do it. In this case, musical theatre. 78-year-old Michael Rubens Bloomberg has been flirting with a presidential campaign for over a decade.
New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg is passing on a run for the White House. Bloomberg has publicly contemplated becoming an independent candidate, but said he decided against it in an op-ed published on the New York Times website last night.
And he was still deciding against it as recently as last March.
Former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg has announced that he will not run for president in 2020. He will not.
Oh, yes, he will. Here he was in November.
I'm ready to get to work, so let's get it on.
Bloomberg finally said he was running because he didn't see anyone else in the field able to beat President Trump. His rivals weren't too impressed.
Our elections should not be something that are bought by billionaires.
And in terms of he's running because of me, last polls I looked at, I'm pretty far ahead.
Yeah. Bloomberg's decision to skip early states in favour of a big spending Super Tuesday-focused strategy was met with initial scepticism.
You should probably spend some time in Iowa. The caucuses are really important.
To think that someone can come in and somehow dismiss that process, that speaks to me more about how they might lead in the future.
But the chaos surrounding the caucuses and Biden's poor showing may have vindicated the Bloomberg strategy. He has surged into third place in the average of national polls this week. And here's why. Instead of just relying on this scintillating speaking style,
let's get it on.
He has spent well over $400 million already on television and online ads, almost 10 times more than Bernie Sanders and close to 34 times as much as Joe Biden. And there's plenty more where that came from. Michael Bloomberg is the 8th richest person on the planet, with a fortune estimated at close to $63 billion. He's spending it on ads like this.
This is America. We can certainly afford to make sure that everybody that needs to see a doctor can see a doctor. Everybody that needs medicines to stay healthy can get those medicines.
You should know, he did it as mayor. He'll get it done as president.
I'm Mike Bloomberg, and I approve this message.
And he did get some things done as mayor, but there are a few things he doesn't like to talk about so much these days.
The president deserves our support. We are here to support him.
But by him, he means him.
General.
That's right. Michael Bloomberg was a Republican who supported George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. Politically, he has been back and forth quite a bit. A Democrat before he ran for mayor as a Republican, then as an independent, then as a Republican again, then as an independent again. He registered as a Democrat in 2018 and gave over $100 million to their midterm candidates. Bloomberg has also given away around $8 billion to various philanthropic causes, about 13% of his net worth.
Nearly all profits from Bloomberg LP go to Bloomberg Philanthropies, which is dedicated to saving and improving lives around the world.
Fair to say, though, Chaz, that line between Bloomberg's politics and charity is pretty blurry. He's accused of using his wealth to buy support and using his charities to make it all a tax deduction.
Yeah, it does seem like an amazing coincidence that Bloomberg's charitable donations increased from $500 million a year to $3 billion a year just before he ran for president. And that included donations to many of the mayors who are now endorsing him.
Coincidental!
Yeah, of course, but he's not just spending money on ads and donations. Bloomberg's also snaffling up all the good staffers by paying them twice what other campaigns offer, as well as throwing in laptops and the latest iPhones, and for some lucky staffers, fully furnished luxury apartments for them to stay in.
You forgot the $1,000 a day on sushi.
That too.
Bloomberg has also used up a lot of his money in hush money payments against allegations of making disparaging comments about female employees and demeaning jokes. In the 1990s, 4 women filed sexual harassment or discrimination suits against Bloomberg. He settled a number of cases while denying most of the allegations, including that he ordered one employee to have an abortion, saying, quote, "kill it."
Do you think you've made any mistakes in the way that you treated female employees at your company?
I don't. Not everybody's happy, but we have an enviable record of treating people the same in terms of compensation and promotions and authority.
Certainly in terms of compensation. And Bloomberg then slapped non-disclosure agreements on those women, which he still won't release them from. You see, John, for all Bloomberg knows, the women wouldn't want him to allow them to speak. if they wanted to speak.
Yeah, right. But when it comes to treating people the same, Mike Bloomberg also has something of a race problem, Chaz.
Sure does. The man that Trump calls Mini Mike was behind a surveillance program of New York Muslims that trampled plenty of civil liberties while not producing one actionable piece of intelligence. Then there was the time that Bloomberg blamed pressure on banks not to discriminate against minority borrowers for the Great Recession. Elizabeth Warren leapt all over that one.
I want to be clear about this. That crisis would not have been averted if the banks had been able to be bigger racists. And anyone who thinks that
But Bloomberg's problem at the moment is this leaked audio from a 2015 speech he made where he described the theory behind his most controversial policy as mayor of New York, stop and frisk.
95% of your murderers and murder victims fit one MO. You can just take the description, Xerox it, and pass it out to all the cops. They are male minorities, 15 to 25. If you want to spend the money, put a lot of cops in the street, put those cops where the crime is, which means in minority neighborhoods. So it's one of the unintended consequences is people say, oh my God, you are arresting kids for marijuana, they're all minorities. Yes, that's true. Why? Because we put all the cops in the minority neighborhoods. Yes, that's true. Why do we do it? Because that's where all the crime is. And the way you get the guns out of the kids' hands is to throw them against the wall and frisk them.
And then people added that audio to this video where Bloomberg addressed concerns that stop and frisk affected a disproportionate percentage of black and brown people.
It's not a disproportionate percentage of those who witnesses and victims describe as committing the murder. In that case, incidentally, I think we disproportionately stop whites too much and minorities too little.
So now mini Mike Bloomberg has a maxi political problem. But was he actually right? Well, Bloomberg was certainly right about one thing. Most of the people getting arrested for serious crimes in New York are black or Hispanic. We're talking 93% of murder arrests, 86% of rape arrests, 92% of robbery arrests, 85% of felony assaults, and 96% of shooting arrests. But is the way to get the guns out of kids' hands to throw them up against the wall and frisk them? That's the problem. The cops only seized 0.15 guns for every 100 searches, which according to one study was no greater than would be produced merely by searching random people. But of course, these weren't random people, were they? Black people were 9 times as likely as white people to be searched by police, even though they were no more likely than white people to be arrested as a result of the searches. And it's not like they were providing some reason to be searched. 90% of those searched were completely innocent of any wrongdoing. No loitering, no jaywalking, no nothing. In fact, according to the NYCLU, the New York Civil Liberties Union, in less than a quarter of these searches did the officer even suspect that the person might have a gun. So they weren't being very picky. In 2011, the NYCLU found more police searches of black males between the ages of 14 and 24 than the total population of 14 to 24-year-old black males in New York. And by the way, when searched, white people actually had slightly more contraband than the black people did. White people also had more weapons overall, although admittedly black people did have more guns. A whopping 0.1% more guns. Now, to be fair, Bloomberg did say at the time that his aim wasn't necessarily to arrest people so much as to make guns too hot to carry, and therefore preventing guns being carried in the first place. And we can't really know for sure if that worked. Maybe it did. And the stop and frisk policy does continue to have its defenders, like President Trump, for example, who during the 2016 campaign called for a stop and frisk policy to be implemented nationwide. That might be why when Trump tweeted this week that Bloomberg was totally racist because of stop and frisk, that tweet was disappeared a few minutes later. However, regardless of what Trump thinks, Bloomberg is at least claiming to have changed his mind. He said that he inherited stop and frisk, and by the time he left office, he'd cut it back by 95%. But he should have cut it faster and sooner. Now, that there is one way to put it. Another way to put it is that Bloomberg oversaw a 7-fold increase in stop and frisk from 97,000 stops all the way up to 685,000 stops. And the only reason he cut it back there was because he lost a court case. And he still complained it was a very dangerous decision made by a judge that doesn't understand how policing works and that crime can come back any time. The criminals think they're going to get away with things. And then he appealed the decision and lost again, and the New York Council passed legislation against racial profiling, which he vetoed, and then the council overrode his veto. And then 6 years later, when he was about to run for president, that is when Bloomberg decided stop and frisk had been a bad idea all along. So that is another way of putting it. The bottom line is this: even ideas that might seem okay at first can lead to very unfortunate results. Thanks, John. That's great.
Coming up, we're going to be talking to the judge who stopped stop and frisk.
But first, it turns out Mike Bloomberg isn't the only candidate with a political identity crisis.
In 2013, federal court judge Shira Shendlin heard the case of Floyd v. the City of New York. It was a class action which tested the constitutionality of stop and frisk. She ruled against the practice. At the time, though, Mike Bloomberg was standing by the tactic.
We go to where the reports of crime are. Those, unfortunately, happen to be poor neighborhoods and minority neighborhoods.
Shira Shendlin is with us from our studio in New York City. Judge, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you.
So defenders of stop and frisk say it drove down the murder rate, it saved maybe 1,000 lives or more, reduced a bunch of crimes. It's a bit of a hassle, like queuing up at the airport, but ultimately it was a good thing. What are they missing?
I would not accept that description, I must say, because when we had a huge number of stops, we know that 90% of them resulted in no law enforcement action whatsoever. The people were stopped, their day was interrupted, they were often searched, and they were immediately let go. Of the remaining 10% who got a summons, some of them had an open warrant, or it was a very minor offense like an open container or marijuana in your pocket. The rate of seizing something as serious as a gun was something like 0.5% of all the stops, maybe 1% of the frisks, but that means 0.5% of all the stops. So I'm not convinced that it saved 1,000 lives or that it interdicted any major crime at all.
Judge, what about the harder to quantify deterrent effect, the idea that because of these laws, bad people stopped hanging out on street corners with guns?
Well, so we're told. I mean, that was the theory that the mayor and the police commissioner believed, that if the people knew they were going to get stopped when they went out, they would leave their guns at home. We heard that rationale many times, but I'm not even convinced of that. I don't know that people were walking around with their guns, assuming they wouldn't be stopped, and then suddenly when the policy grew, they said, oh, I'll leave my gun at home. I really don't think that's the way it works.
Of course, Judge, after the court case occurred, Mayor Bloomberg had words for you personally. He said you personally didn't understand how policing works. Do you have a response for that?
Well, because what I remember him saying was far worse. He said the city is going to blow up because of her. Crime is going to go through the roof because of her. And he was definitely wrong on that prediction. The good news was, and it was very satisfying for me, is that crime didn't go up at all. In fact, it continued to drop. So if he was wrong about that, maybe he was wrong about saying I didn't understand policing. The fact is, we knew that a lot of beat cops, that means cops on the street, actually wanted stop and frisk to end because it had put pressure on them to meet quotas, to make stops that they knew were not based on reasonable suspicion. So they were quite happy to see this policy end. We knew this anecdotally.
Judge, did you learn anything about Mike Bloomberg from the way his administration conducted themselves during that court case that maybe could be applicable today during the primaries?
I would answer that yes and no. I think he is a determined person, and I think when he's committed to something, it's very hard to get him to backtrack. It's very hard to get him to change his mind and do something different. And I do believe that he deeply believed in the efficacy of this policy. It had been started by his predecessor, Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and his police commissioner, Ray Kelly, really pushed him hard on this and said, this is going to make the city safer. So he became what I might call a true believer. And once he's a true believer, it's very hard to turn him around. But that can be a good thing.
So, Judge, despite your differences with Mike Bloomberg, you don't seem to be saying that he was a lousy mayor and he'd make a lousy president.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. I think of stop and frisk as his blind spot, his Achilles heel, whatever you want to call it. He made an error, and that error is unforgivable because it affected hundreds of thousands of lives, primarily of young Black and Latino males. So I don't forgive him for that. But I say that there's always two sides to a person. There's always two sides to a story. So while that was an error and a blind spot, that is not disqualifying to me, because there are many things about the mayor that I think would make for a very good president. He's a businessman who was successful, unlike our current president. He's a technocrat. He understands how to really accomplish things. And I think he's the kind of guy who will implement what he says he will implement.
And we'll have more from Judge Shearer on Friday night's Fireside Chat. She was amongst more than 2,000 former federal prosecutors to call for Attorney General Bill Barr to resign this week over his meddling in the Roger Stone sentencing affair.
So far, though, the Democratic primary process has been focusing very much on the first caucus state, Iowa, and the first state to hold a primary, New Hampshire, which, as we've seen, were two of the least diverse states in America. But all of that changed this week as the remaining presidential hopefuls headed west to the silver state of Nevada. For decades, Nevada has been famous for the desert oasis of gambling, drive-through weddings and lounge singers that is Las Vegas. Then, as now, the state's economy is dominated by tourism. Around a quarter of workers are in the leisure sector, mostly casinos. Nevada's population of around 3 million is growing at the sixth fastest rate in the country, up 35% since the turn of this century. And it is diverse. Majority-minority, in fact. 49% white, 29% Hispanic, 10% black, 9% Asian, and about 15% of workers are in unions. That's about 50% higher than the national average. It's Nevada's large Hispanic and Latino population that makes it an important early test of a candidate's appeal. OK, let's just stop for a second. In case you're wondering, there is a difference between Hispanic and Latino, even though they can overlap and they're often treated as interchangeable. Hispanic simply identifies people by language, any Spanish speaker or somebody descended from a Spanish speaker. Latino identifies somebody by geographical origin. It's a contraction of Latino Americano. It's anyone from South or Central America or the Caribbean, including those who speak native languages, Portuguese and English, as well as Spanish. Technically, neither are racial identifiers. Hispanics and Latinos can be brown, black, white and anything in between. Oh, and in case you're wondering why there are so many Latinos and Hispanics in places like Nevada, California, Arizona and Texas, they didn't all come to the United States for work. Originally, it was the United States that came to them. Up until the 1840s, Nevada, California, Texas and most of the southwest of the United States was part of Mexico. OK, where were we? Nevada has been an important part of the presidential nominating process since 2008, when its primary was turned into a caucus and moved into the weeks following Iowa and New Hampshire. So Latino voters can make a big difference.
Senator Obama, do you believe there's a history of a division where Latino voters will not vote for a black candidate?
Not in Illinois. They all voted for me.
Like a lot of caucuses, Nevadas are criticised for being time-consuming and confusing. They're held from 10 a.m. on a Saturday. Turnout is low, maybe 10%. They only elect district delegates, who in turn vote for county delegates a month or two later, who in turn elect state delegates, who ultimately elect national delegates, who are the ones who vote for the presidential nominee. It is a bit weird. Obama won 45% of those district delegates in January 2008, but by the time the state convention rolled around in May, he claimed 55% of national delegates. Little wonder in 2016, when Hillary Clinton was up against Bernie Sanders, things turned a bit nasty.
These images of angry Bernie Sanders supporters fighting over delegates in Nevada tonight coming to represent a nasty feud shaking up the Democratic Party.
The Hispanic and Latino vote really matters to Democrats in particular. In 2008, Barack Obama won 67% to John McCain's 31%. 4 years later, Obama won 71% to Mitt Romney's 27%. And in 2016, Hillary Clinton won 66% to Trump's 28%. In 2020, Latinos are expected to overtake African Americans as the largest minority group, with 32 million eligible voters, over 13% of all eligible voters. In California and Texas, the two biggest prizes on Super Tuesday on March 3, 30% of eligible voters are Latinos. So, Nevada should give us a big clue about what the next few frantic weeks have in store.
Tell me quick, ain't love a kick in the
This week saw the release of yet another behind the scenes of the White House book. This one revealing allegedly a presidential obsession with one particular animal.
Badgers. Are they mean to people, or are they friendly creatures? How do they work exactly? Do they have a personality, or are they boring? What kind of damage could a badger do to a person with its flashy, sharp claws? Badgers.
Just before we go, there's been a breakthrough in Afghanistan.
The war's over.
No, there's been
a peace deal.
Well, there may be.
A ceasefire?
No. After a 7-day reduction in violence, there may be a peace agreement, John, which could see our 135-day timetable.
withdrawal?
No, a drawdown from 13,000 to 8,500 troops. And then a complete withdrawal in 3 to 5 years.
Woot, woot.
Although it's not clear exactly what complete withdrawal means. Look, there have now been 18 mission commanders in Afghanistan. Count them. Meanwhile, America dropped 7,500 bombs last year, a record since they started counting back in 2006. And the Taliban and friends carry out about 25,000 attacks of their own. I'll take whatever progress we can get, thanks. Fingers crossed.
In the past 50 years or so, vice presidents have struggled to win the top job. Hubert Humphrey was nominated in 1968, but he lost the general, then failed to win the nomination again in 1972 and 1976. Gerry Ford was VP before being appointed president following Nixon's resignation. Ford won the nomination in 1976, but lost the general. Former VP Walter Mondale won the 1984 nomination but lost the general. Former VP Dan Quayle ran in 2000 and didn't even get the nomination. And VP Al Gore won the Democratic nomination in 2000 but lost the general. The lesson is all VPs who ran for president were nominated at least once, except for Dan Quayle. Yet of the 9 campaigns where a VP ran, they were elected president only twice. Richard Nixon in 1968 and George Bush in 1988. A 22% success rate, that's not great. And that is all for another trip to Planet America. Do join us, though, for a fireside chat on ABC News at 8 o'clock this Friday night for a wrap of the Nevada Democratic debate.
Are they going to stop and frisk Mike Bloomberg before he's laid on stage, though?
I hope they do.
And you're going to find more on iView, Facebook and YouTube.
Bye-bye.